The relationship between humans and wildlife in Africa has always been characterized by a complex mixture of reverence, fear, coexistence, and conflict that varies dramatically depending on context, culture, and the specific species involved. For those who work in wildlife conservation, who spend their days monitoring animal populations, conducting research, or guiding tourists through protected wilderness areas, encounters with dangerous predators are occupational hazards that are managed through careful protocols, extensive training, and a healthy respect for the capabilities and unpredictability of creatures that have evolved over millions of years to be supremely efficient hunters. Yet even the most experienced wildlife professionals, people who have spent decades working in close proximity to lions, leopards, elephants, and other potentially lethal animals, occasionally find themselves in situations that defy all their training and experience, moments when animals behave in ways that challenge fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between human and wildlife, about the nature of animal intelligence and communication, and about whether wild creatures can deliberately seek human assistance when facing crises they cannot resolve through their own capabilities. This is the story of one such moment, an encounter that occurred on a dusty road in Botswana's Okavango Delta in July 2020, and that would be captured on video, shared millions of times across social media platforms, analyzed by animal behavior experts, and debated by scientists trying to understand what the footage revealed about lion cognition, problem-solving, and the potential for meaningful communication between species separated by vast evolutionary distances. The incident involved a wildlife guide named David Motsumi, whose 15 years of experience leading safari tours through some of Africa's most spectacular wilderness areas had given him what he thought was comprehensive understanding of how to read animal behavior and respond appropriately to unexpected encounters. But nothing in those 15 years had prepared him for what would happen on that particular afternoon when a lioness did something that seemed to belong more to fiction than to documented wildlife behavior. David had been working for Wilderness Safaris, one of Botswana's premier ecotourism companies, operating luxury camps and mobile safari operations throughout the Okavango Delta and other prime wildlife areas. His responsibilities included leading game drives for guests staying at the company's various camps, providing interpretation and education about the ecosystem and the animals they encountered, ensuring guest safety during close encounters with dangerous wildlife, and contributing to the company's conservation monitoring efforts by recording sightings and behavioral observations that help track animal populations and movements. On this particular day, David was returning to camp after dropping off a group of guests at a remote airstrip for their departure flight, driving alone in the company's specially modified safari vehicle, a sturdy Land Cruiser equipped with elevated seating that provided excellent visibility across the landscape. The route he was following was a well-used track that wound through a mixture of mopane woodland and more open grassland, crossing several seasonal watercourses that were dry at this time of year, but that would fill during the rains and create temporary barriers that made some areas inaccessible for months at a time. David knew this route intimately, having driven it hundreds of times over his years with the company, and he navigated with the relaxed confidence of someone completely familiar with the terrain. His attention divided between watching the track ahead for obstacles or interesting wildlife sightings and mentally planning the evening game drive he would be leading later with a new group of guests who had arrived that morning. The afternoon was hot and still, with temperatures approaching 40 degrees Celsius, the kind of oppressive heat that made most animals seek shade and remain inactive until the relative cool of evening encouraged movement and activity. As David rounded a bend in the track, approaching a section where the road passed through denser vegetation with reduced visibility to either side, he saw something that made him immediately slow the vehicle and begin assessing the situation with the heightened awareness that years of experience had ingrained as automatic response to potential danger. Approximately 50 meters ahead, standing directly in the middle of the narrow track and facing toward his approaching vehicle, was a lioness. Her presence on the road itself was not particularly unusual, as lions often used. The easier walking provided by roads and tracks rather than pushing through dense vegetation. shotguns, and they would sometimes rest on roads where the open space provided good visibility and the bare earth was slightly cooler than the surrounding grass and soil. But several aspects of this lioness's behavior and appearance immediately struck David as abnormal and concerning. First, she was not moving off the road as vehicles approached, which was the typical response of lions in this area who were accustomed to safari vehicles, but who still maintained appropriate wariness and would generally move aside to let vehicles pass. Instead, she was holding her position in the center of the track, directly blocking passage, her body oriented toward the approaching vehicle in a manner that seemed almost deliberate, as if she was intentionally positioning herself as an obstacle. Second, her posture and body language were unusual and difficult to interpret. She was not displaying obvious aggression, her ears were not flattened back, her tail was not lashing in agitation, and she wasn't showing teeth or adopting the tense, coiled posture that preceded an attack. But neither was she displaying the relaxed indifference or calm alertness that characterized lions who were simply resting or moving through an area. Instead, she seemed agitated in a way that David couldn't quite categorize, pacing a few steps in one direction, then turning and pacing back, occasionally looking directly at his vehicle, then looking away toward the vegetation beside the road, her movements suggesting distress or urgency rather than either aggression or calm. Third, and most concerning from a safety perspective, David could see as he brought his vehicle to a complete stop about 30 meters from the lioness that she appeared to be injured or in physical distress. Her breathing was labored and visible, her flanks heaving with each breath in a way that suggested either extreme exertion, overheating, or pain. Her gait when she paced was slightly uneven, though David couldn't immediately identify which limb might be affected or what might be causing the irregularity. And her overall body condition, while not emaciated, seemed slightly poor for a lioness in an area with abundant prey, her ribs more visible than would be ideal, suggesting she might have been struggling to hunt effectively for some time. David's immediate assessment, based on his experience and training, was that this was potentially a dangerous situation. An injured, distressed predator was unpredictable and might react defensively to perceived threats, and his vehicle, while providing some protection, was an open safari vehicle without a solid roof or sides, leaving him exposed if the lioness decided to charge or attack. Following standard safety protocols for such situations, David kept his engine running, maintained his distance, and prepared to reverse if the lioness showed any signs of approaching aggressively or if her behavior escalated toward threat displays. He reached for his radio to report the sighting to other guides in the area and to camp management, both as a safety measure so others would know his location if communication was lost, and as a courtesy to alert other vehicles that might be approaching from the opposite direction about the potential roadblock and the need for caution. But before he could raise the radio to his mouth, the lioness did something that made him freeze in absolute astonishment, his hand suspended motionless as his brain struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. The lioness, who had been pacing and looking between David's vehicle and the vegetation beside the road, suddenly stopped her agitated movement and looked directly at David, making eye contact in a way that felt almost like deliberate communication, like she was trying to get his attention and ensure he was watching what she was about to do. Then, in a manner that seemed shockingly purposeful and deliberate, she walked several steps off the road toward the dense vegetation on the left side, stopped, looked back at David as if checking that he was still watching and understanding, then returned to her position blocking the road. She repeated this sequence, walking toward the vegetation, looking back at David, returning to block the road, then doing it again, the pattern so clear and consistent that even David's rational mind, which was insisting that he must be misinterpreting normal lion behavior through anthropomorphic projection, had to acknowledge that this looked for all the world like the lioness was trying to lead him somewhere, trying to communicate that she wanted him to follow her, or to pay attention to something in the direction she kept indicating. David sat in his vehicle, his mind racing through possible explanations and appropriate responses. Every principle of wildlife guiding and safety protocols screamed that he should not exit his vehicle in the presence of a large predator, that he should not approach closer to an agitated and potentially injured lioness, and that he should absolutely not follow a lion into dense vegetation where visibility would be reduced and escape routes limited. But years of experience reading animal behavior, combined with the undeniable clarity of the pattern he was observing, suggested that something extraordinary was happening, something that demanded a response beyond simply radioing for backup and waiting for the situation to resolve itself or for the lioness to move away. David made a decision that he would later describe as being driven by intuition and by the conviction that this lioness was genuinely trying to communicate something important, even though he couldn't rationally justify why he believed this or why he was willing to take the risks that following her would entail. He put his vehicle in gear and slowly, cautiously, began creeping forward, watching the lioness's reaction carefully and prepared to stop or reverse immediately if her body language shifted toward aggression. The lioness, seeing the vehicle begin to move, showed what David would swear was visible relief in her posture, the tension in her body easing slightly as if his movement represented the response she had been trying to elicit. She turned and walked off the road into the vegetation, not running or moving with the swift purpose of a lion heading somewhere specific, but walking slowly and deliberately, repeatedly looking back to ensure David was following, waiting when the vehicle's progress was slowed by obstacles or rough terrain. The entire behavioral sequence so reminiscent of a domestic dog trying to lead its owner somewhere that David found himself experiencing a profound sense of cognitive dissonance, unable to reconcile what he was observing with everything he thought he knew about wild lion behavior. David followed for approximately 70 meters, his vehicle pushing slowly through vegetation that scraped against the sides and undercarriage, his visibility reduced to just a few meters in any direction, every instinct screaming warnings about the danger of following a predator into this kind of terrain, but his curiosity and growing conviction that the lioness genuinely needed help overriding his caution. Then the vegetation opened slightly into a small clearing, and David saw something that made his breath catch and his hands grip the steering wheel hard enough that his knuckles went white. There, in the clearing, lay 2 lion cubs, probably around 3 months old based on their size, and they were in obvious, severe distress. Both cubs were panting heavily, their small bodies convulsing with the effort of breathing, their eyes partly closed, their movements weak and uncoordinated. The ground around them showed signs of vomiting and diarrhea, and even from the distance of his vehicle, David could see that these cubs were critically ill and likely dying. The lioness, having successfully led David to this spot, immediately went to her cubs and lay down beside them, looking up at David with an expression that he would later struggle to describe in objective scientific terms, but which seemed to convey desperation, hope, and an appeal for help that transcended species boundaries. David's mind was racing as he tried to understand what he was seeing and what could have caused this acute illness in cubs who had presumably been healthy until very recently. The symptoms, the severity of the distress, and the fact that both cubs were affected simultaneously suggested poisoning rather than disease or injury. His immediate thought was that the cubs might have consumed toxic plants, but lion cubs at this age were still primarily nursing and wouldn't typically ingest significant amounts of vegetation. The more likely and more sinister possibility was that the cubs had been exposed to poison through their mother's milk if she had consumed a poisoned carcass, or possibly that they had encountered and ingested poisoned meat directly if someone had deliberately placed toxins in the area. Poison was a serious and growing problem in many parts of Africa, used illegally by livestock owners trying to kill predators who threatened their animals, or by poachers targeting lions for their body parts, or sometimes simply by people who viewed predators as threats or nuisances to be eliminated. The toxins used were typically agricultural pesticides, readily available and devastatingly effective, causing rapid onset of severe symptoms including neurological effects, respiratory distress, vomiting, diarrhea, and without treatment, death within hours to a few days, depending on the dose and the specific compound involved. If David's assessment was correct and these cubs had been poisoned, they needed veterinary intervention immediately if there was any hope of survival, and even with treatment, The prognosis might be poor, depending on how much poison they had absorbed and how long it had been since exposure. David grabbed his radio and made an urgent call to his camp manager, explaining the situation in terse, rapid sentences, describing what he had found and requesting immediate mobilization of veterinary assistance and any antidote treatments that might be available at the camp or that could be obtained from the nearest veterinary facility. The camp manager, a woman named Patricia Kobe, who had worked in wildlife conservation and ecotourism in Botswana for over 20 years, immediately grasped the severity and urgency of the situation. She contacted the Okavango Lion Conservation Project, a research and conservation organization that worked throughout the Delta and that had veterinary expertise and equipment for treating wildlife emergencies. She also contacted the Department of Wildlife and National Parks to report the suspect, knowing that if poison had been deliberately placed in this area, it represented a serious threat not just to these specific cubs, but to the broader wildlife population and required immediate investigation and response. Within 45 minutes, which felt like an eternity to David as he sat in his vehicle maintaining his vigil while the lioness paced frantically between her dying cubs and his vehicle, seemingly understanding that help was coming but desperate for it to arrive faster, a helicopter landed in the clearing. The veterinary team that emerged, led by Dr. Elizabeth Kwame, brought portable medical equipment, various antidote drugs that might counteract common poisons used in the region, intravenous fluids, and tranquilizer equipment that would allow them to sedate the lioness if she became aggressive during treatment of her cubs. But as the team approached, speaking in calm, low voices and moving slowly to avoid triggering defensive aggression, the lioness did something that everyone present would later describe as one of the most extraordinary things they had witnessed in their combined decades of wildlife experience. She backed away from her cubs, moving several meters distant, and lay down in a position that presented no threat, watching intently, but allowing the veterinary team complete access to the cubs without any interference or protective aggression. Dr. Kwame would later say that the lioness's behavior seemed to show understanding that these humans were there to help, that her cubs needed intervention she couldn't provide, and that she needed to allow the medical team to work without obstruction. While such interpretations risked anthropomorphism, the objective behavioral observations were undeniable. The lioness had voluntarily removed herself from the immediate area where her critically ill cubs lay and had maintained a non-threatening posture throughout the entire medical intervention that followed, behavior that was highly atypical for a mother predator whose cubs were being approached and handled by humans. The veterinary team worked with focused intensity, quickly assessing the cubs and confirming David's suspicion that this was acute poisoning, most likely from a pesticide in the organophosphate class based on the specific constellation of symptoms including the severe respiratory distress, excessive salivation, muscle tremors, and gastrointestinal effects. Dr. Kwame immediately administered atropine, the standard antidote for organophosphate poisoning, giving each cub a carefully calculated dose based on their estimated weights. She established intravenous lines in both cubs, no easy feat given their small size and poor condition, and began administering fluids to combat dehydration and to help flush the toxins from their systems. She gave additional supportive medications, including anti-nausea drugs, pain relief, and compounds that would help protect their organs from the damage that the poison was causing at the cellular level. The treatment continued for nearly 2 hours, with the veterinary team monitoring the cubs continuously, adjusting medication doses based on their response, and providing the intensive supportive care that gave these desperately ill young lions their only chance of survival. Throughout this entire period, the mother lioness remained where she had positioned herself, lying down but with her head up and her eyes never leaving her cubs or the humans working on them, occasionally making soft vocalizations that seemed directed at her cubs, sounds that Dr. Kwame recognized. Their breathing became less labored and more regular. The muscle tremors that had been racking their small bodies began to subside. Their eyes, which had been dull and partly closed, opened more fully and began to track movement around them. The immediate crisis was passing, though Dr. Kwame cautioned that the cubs were not out of danger yet, and would require continued monitoring and possibly additional treatment to ensure they fully recovered from their toxic exposure. The veterinary team made the decision to take the cubs back to a facility where they could receive round-the-clock intensive care for at least the next 24 to 48 hours, the critical period when complications could still arise or when the cubs could relapse if their bodies couldn't completely eliminate and recover from the poison's effects. This decision created a new dilemma. Removing the cubs from their mother, even temporarily, and for medical reasons, risked breaking the maternal bond and could result in rejection when the cubs were eventually returned. But leaving the cubs in the field without continued medical support almost certainly meant death, as they were still too weak to nurse effectively and still required medications and monitoring that couldn't be provided in the wild. Dr. Kwame approached the mother lioness, speaking to her in a soft, gentle voice. Even though the words meant nothing to the lion, the tone intended to communicate calm intent and lack of threat. She needed to get close enough to sedate the cubs for transport, as moving them while conscious could cause stress that might worsen their already precarious condition. What happened next would be analyzed and debated by animal behaviorists for months afterward. As Dr. Kwame approached the cubs with a syringe containing mild sedative, the lioness stood but didn't adopt an aggressive posture or make any move to intervene. Instead, she walked forward, approached to within 2 meters of Dr. Kwame, closer than any wild lioness should have been comfortable getting to a human, and sat down, watching as the veterinarian administered the sedation to first one cub, then the other. Once both cubs were sedated and sleeping peacefully, the veterinary team carefully placed them in specially designed transport carriers that would keep them secure and protected during the helicopter flight. They carried the carriers to the aircraft, loaded them carefully, and prepared for departure. Throughout this process, the lioness followed at a distance of perhaps 5 to 10 meters, clearly tracking where her cubs were being taken, her body language suggesting anxiety and distress, but never aggression or attempts to interfere. As the helicopter began spooling up its engines, the lioness approached even closer, and David, who had been watching and documenting the entire sequence on his camera, captured footage that would become central to the viral spread of this story. The lioness looked directly into the helicopter where her sedated cubs lay in their carriers, then looked at Dr. Kwame, then back at the cubs, her head moving between the two in a pattern that seemed almost like she was trying to confirm that her cubs would be safe, that these humans who had treated them would continue to care for them, that this separation was necessary and temporary rather than permanent. Dr. Kwame, moving on instinct and feeling rather than following any protocol from veterinary training, spoke directly to the lioness, telling her that her cubs would be safe, that they would be cared for, and that she would see them again once they were strong enough to return. The words were for the humans as much as for the lioness, a way of acknowledging the profound trust this wild animal had displayed and the responsibility that trust created. Then the helicopter lifted off, carrying the cubs away while their mother stood watching from the ground, the downdraft from the rotors flattening the grass around her and blowing her fur back. But she remained standing, watching until the aircraft was out of sight before finally turning and walking slowly back into the vegetation, alone. Over the next 3 days, the cubs received intensive veterinary care at the facility where they had been taken, a wildlife rehabilitation center operated by the Okavango Lion Conservation Project. They were given continued antidote treatment, intravenous fluids, nutritional support, antibiotics to prevent secondary infections that their compromised immune systems might not be able to fight off effectively, and round-the-clock monitoring to watch for any complications or setbacks. Both cubs survived, though their recovery was gradual and required careful management. By the 4th day, they were strong enough to be eating properly. Their neurological symptoms had resolved completely, and their energy levels were returning to normal for cubs of their age. The fact that she had identified humans as potential helpers, had deliberately sought out David's vehicle, and had successfully communicated her need and guided him to her cubs suggested planning and intentional communication at a level that many researchers had not thought lions capable of achieving. Other scientists urged caution in interpretation, suggesting that the behavior, while certainly remarkable, might be explainable through simpler mechanisms. Perhaps the lioness had associated vehicles with humans who had helped animals before, creating a learned association rather than demonstrating sophisticated reasoning. Perhaps her behavior was driven by desperation and general distress that happened to manifest in ways that achieved the desired outcome without requiring the complex cognition that more anthropomorphic interpretations suggested. The debate was complex and nuanced, with valid points on multiple sides, and it continued in scientific journals and conferences for months after the incident. Regardless of the precise cognitive mechanisms involved, the practical outcome was clear. A lioness had successfully sought human help for her poisoned cubs, had communicated her need effectively enough that a human understood and responded, and had shown remarkable trust throughout the process of treatment and temporary separation from her cubs. The incident also sparked important conversations about poisoning as a conservation threat. The investigation into how these cubs had been poisoned revealed that someone had indeed placed poisoned meat in the area, though whether targeting lions specifically or setting out poison for other reasons remained unclear. The authorities increased monitoring and enforcement efforts in the region, working with local communities to address the underlying conflicts between people and predators that drove some individuals to use poison. The story of the lioness who stopped a car in the middle of the road because she needed help fast stands as one of the most documented and compelling accounts of wild animals deliberately seeking human assistance in crisis situations. It challenges our assumptions about animal communication and problem-solving, raises profound questions about consciousness and cognition in species we share this planet with, and reminds us that the boundaries between human and animal experience may be more permeable than we have traditionally believed. Most importantly, it serves as a powerful testament to what becomes possible when humans respond with compassion and expertise to animals in distress, when we recognize our capacity and responsibility to help when help is needed, and when we remain open to the possibility that animals might reach out across species boundaries to communicate needs that transcend the divisions between wild and civilized, predator and human, them and us.